Welcome everyone. My name is Mahfida and I'm the University Education Department. I'm also one of the student support leads working here. And yeah, I'm delighted to introduce our guest today. Our guest is a Western scholar from the UK. She is Dr. Lorena Sanchez. So Dr. Lorena is a senior lecturer in the
Law and education.
Yes, and then she is at the University of Fellowship. So today we're going to have the opportunity to learn more about your research work, career, and also our college year. So it's interesting that we're all cell phone brands. So this is a good reminder. I just want to ask you please that please turn off your cell phones. As Rob mentioned, that we are going to film and record our conversation. So if we are comfortable with the background of the recording, please let us know. And that is good for comfortable. So before we begin, I'll request our head of the department, Officer Andre Pasauri, to do the land introduction and also to welcome Lorena.
Just checking my notes, which I did here. So anyway, I'd like to start with the acknowledgement, land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement is a recognition that we are located on campus that has a particular history and a colonial history that we have not been, nor are we the first to inhabit this land, that there have been communities and peoples that have preceded us for longer periods of time, for centuries and millennia, living, growing, building the language, the culture, the relationship on this very land. Their community life has been disrupted by the processes that involve the creation of what we come to know today as the state of Canada. So this land acknowledgement is by way of saying we recognize, but not only, that we also try to build on this recognition to inform our own decisions in relation to educational studies and the area of educational studies in terms of understanding what does it mean to operate in a land that has a particular history, and what kind of an education for what kind of land, and what kind of land and homeland at that do we want to build. It's not really obvious. So may this opening be a reminder of the history of this land, on our role in it. We are not disconnected from that history. We may not come with our armies or settlers, but in a way, we are kinds of settlers with our degrees and institutions and all the kinds of things that we produce in knowledge, etc. So we need to be absolutely careful how we deploy these elements in our fostering of education among younger generations, especially in our case, teachers, education policymakers, adult education, higher education officials, etc. Finally, it is an opportunity also to remember that the land on which we are is not the only land that has been subjected to the vagaries of colonialism and dispossession, that these kinds of processes have been deploying themselves and continue to deploy themselves in other parts of the world constantly. And I doubt there is a country or a place that has not suffered the disruptions of colonial forces. So let this also be an acknowledgement of our commitment to engage the education that we offer in this department in ways which allow some redress of these effects in terms of building a homeland that is worth wanting. At the same, so thank you for that. And I would like first, I go to my note, I would like to welcome Dr. Lorena Sanchez Tyson, who comes to us as a senior lecturer in education in the School of Law and Education at the University of Hertfordshire in the UK. Or should we say England, perhaps? Huh?
Yes.
See, also already the kind of place and interplays. Do we say UK, Great Britain? You see, each one of these contains layers of, call it whatever, conquest, colonialism, and whatnot. Anyway, our welcoming to Dr. Sanchez Tyson, who has generously accepted this invitation for the inaugural lecture to entrust to us her own expertise and knowledge on questions of development, sustainability, and relationships between education, inequality, and sustainability across different global contexts. So we very much look forward to this. Dr. Sanchez Tyson is particularly interested, and I find this commendable, in how educational knowledge, policy, and practice are shaped by power. Colonialism might have been one of them, place and history. So we are not kind of floating bubbles in the ether of the cosmos. We are grounded in particular material histories. And so we welcome that kind of perspective and we look forward to it. I would like also to seize this opportunity to thank my esteemed colleague, Rob van Weinsberg, Dr. van Weinsberg, for the initiative actually to offer his department this activity of a series on questions of sustainability and education. And thank him for the efforts to make us benefit today from the lecture of Dr. Sanchez Tyson. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us and for offering us the benefits of your knowledge and expertise and background, and the floor is yours. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sanchez.
In my research so please tell us about your research journey and also how everything has shaped.
I'm happy to answer that. First, I'd like you to just say how we knew each other.
So it's interesting. Lauren has been my supervisor when I was doing my second master's at UCL. So that was the first time when I met her. And then we always have been in touch, we've
Over
been
the years, yeah.
friends. And yeah, so a couple of months back, she just emailed me saying that I'm coming to visit Vancouver. She was like, okay, I said, of course. Then I'm like, okay, why don't I introduce my board supervisor and do something at the department, and this is how it happened. So, that is my honor to be here, Angela.
Yes, it's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for a very warm welcome. It's really a pleasure, and it's really kind of, to me, kind of reifies the importance of relationship building across countries and institutions and timelines and children growing up and all of these and world crises. And to kind of stay connected, I find it's really important, and it's just lovely, and I hope to meet and talk to many of you and stay connected. Can you repeat your question again? Is it my research background? Is that right? So I sort of came to research and academia in a not a very, maybe none of us really come to it in a very linear way. But I certainly, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be here talking about climate change education and all these things and my background in research, I wouldn't have believed you. I didn't really kind of have it in mind of saying, someday I'll do like doctoral master's level study on this. But I kind of reflecting back, which I try to do very often, I do know that there was always a running thread in sort of my interests, and it was always around how and why and where people engage with text and reading and writing across kind of disciplines, across time and space. Like as a kid, picking up a book and feeling like you're a time traveler, I was always really excited and interested in that. And then when I sort of came into my undergraduate studies, which was around language, I was a language teacher for a long time. I was a translator for a very brief period of time. It sort of, again, the running thread was always that interest in how we sort of circulate different forms of knowledges and histories and who gets to tell which story. And then I came into, I was an adult education, basic literacy instructor for a couple of years. And it was interesting, I worked, with adult learners before, but I hadn't worked with adult learners in basic literacy kind of learning context. And while I found as an instructor somewhat tedious the kind of repetition of the things that you have to do in those sessions, what I found extremely fascinating were the stories behind who was there, who was in that room, how did they get there, what sorts of systems and cracks did they fall through, how is it that these adult learners were engaging in learning, and why, and what was the motivation, and what changed, or what support system did they have or didn't have, why did some of them never attend formalized schooling or had to drop out at an early age. And so I started kind of thinking about the policies and systems behind that. And I applied for a master's, not really knowing where I might land. I applied for scholarships abroad. It's literally on Google saying scholarships abroad. And I did a master's in lifelong learning. And that was sort of where I honed in on my adult literacy perspective and trying to understand that more. What I ended up doing for my master's was a very small scale study trying to understand a specific adult literacy program in Mexico. So that's my home country, it's where I was born and raised, I go to university there. I know I don't sound like it, but that's where I feel kind of that kind of closeness. However, Mexico, just like many places, is a country of many contradictions and many historical omissions in kind of what we say is kind of contemporary Mexico. And within that is an adult education system in education that has a specific branch for adult learners in Spanish and then adult learners in some of the 364 indigenous languages of the country that are documented. And I was quite interested in both of those. So that research was, again, a very small case study where I interviewed one of the founders of that program. That it's not that old, it started in 2007. And I wanted to understand how and why that program came to be. Because again, we're talking about adult education and indigenous adult education in the context of a country, of an educational system that had historically tried to erase that, right? And undermine and suppress and so just trying to understand, how it came to be. I'm sure all of you who've done research know that the more you ask a question and the more you kind of travel that way, the less you know and the more questions you have. So I just said I need to, I was working with my supervisor and I said, oh my gosh, I haven't even scratched the surface here. So what do you think if I think I might want to pursue this at a doctoral level? And again, I had just question marks of I want to do everything. She's like, well, you can't do everything. So I ended up, my doctoral research was sort of expanding on that and what I was able to do, thankfully before pandemic closed borders and all of that. I did some field work in 15 indigenous communities in Mexico across 3 different states. And I wanted to hear directly from the learners and the facilitators of that program. I wasn't interested in the government's narrative of why this program is so good and all the wonderful things and how many people have become literate. So I'll maybe talk about that later. I was interested in hearing how and why people engaged with the program and kind of the role and meaning of literacy in their lives, and whether that was in their indigenous language, in their community context, in different contexts. So again, this idea of literacy as a social practice being very much bound by your history and your context, and perhaps again not always legitimized or perceived the same way, right? So in the government form, literacy was you take these exams and you progress and you transition to learning Spanish and then you get your certificate and oh how wonderful because this. And of course there's a lot to be said about supporting and having everyone have access to, you know, these types of things. But at the same time, I was questioning everything behind it, kind of saying, but what actually is indigenous about this program, right? How are these people, like, why are they there? I don't know if they're that. So, yeah, I don't know. I can talk more about the project, but I don't know how much.
I think I need to just tell everyone that Lorena actually won the prestigious UCL award in 2022 for her outstanding dissertation. So yeah, that was my next question though, that we wanted to know more about that project.
Yeah.
And also, we were talking about the learning and indigenous education, but if you want to add something more, that's fine.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's funny, yeah, I remember submitting self-nominate for that award, and everyone was telling me I should, and I was like, I don't wanna see that thing again. And again, it's, one of those things with researchers will probably, we look at something for so long, and I think again, I was sort of reaching the end of the study going, but what is then going to happen? And I feel like again, I have more questions than I have answers. And I remember talking to a colleague, one of my good friends and the co-author of one of the papers that I'll probably talk about today, where, you know, and these are the things, I know this isn't your question, but I think this is important. One of the things that I always found as a Domino student, maybe others have as well, is kind of these opportunities to just kind of over a coffee, try to solve the world's problems and then you don't, but you try to get somewhere. And it was in one of those conversations where, you know, I'm talking about my findings and I'm saying this is so interesting, but I feel like so little for what is something so big. And she said, you know, maybe this is the end of the thesis, this is the end of your program. She said, maybe this can be your life's work. Like this can be what you carry forward. So in a way, I'm really happy to talk about it because then I didn't want to look at it so much. But so if I were kind of to summarize it, again, there were different chapters from that study that sort of focused on different things. One of them, for example, was around the role of the facilitators as sort of brokers, like intercultural brokers, for example. It was really interesting, kind of their role and their kind of the framing that the government program gave them, which was solidarity. Now I'm forgetting the term. It was something like solidarity figures, and you're like, yeah, because they work for free or they work by productivity, so they only get paid unless a learner passes one of the government exams, which for basic literacy would take years, right? And yet the expectation is, as a solidarity community member, you're just not doing that. So anyway, the kind of professionalized role of teaching, of educators. But kind of, again, if I were to summarize some of the main things, there were really interesting findings around the framings of what literacy was and what it was for. There were framings, and one of the papers I think that was shared was around a lot of these themes came out around like defense and self-defense, which I kind of was trying to probe a little bit and saying like, in what context or what do you mean? And they're saying, well, when you are a speaker of an indigenous language, already you're having to defend yourself against dominant language and the dominant systems. And it doesn't matter that the state by law or is trying to say, well, the legal documents should be in different languages, but when you're talking about hundreds of languages, first of all, I mean, like, capacity-wise, it's difficult. But then it's kind of defense against being taken advantage of. There were people saying, you know, I won't sign anything unless they know how to read it. Yeah, and if I don't know that language, read it. But it wasn't in a kind of antagonistic way necessarily. Again, the theme was more around like building up kind of a support system so that they could, if and when they had to engage with different forms of text in different contexts, signing a job contract, knowing how much you're going to get paid, all of those things that they would kind of. That was one of the motivations. They say I wanted to kind of engage in this program to try to see where and how, you know, I could. Again, I'm drawing from their words, sort of defend myself against the dominant kind of paradigm. There were other kind of themes around self-expression, and I think those of us who are bilingual, trilingual, or navigating multiple languages, we know that, you know, it's very hard to navigate those things. You sort of, I call it sometimes like a split personality. If there's a linguist here, I know that there's some theory about that, of like who you are in your home language and the way that you relate with the world and with people is quite different, and to sort of have to have kind of access to learning opportunities where actually it's encouraged. Then no, instead of, you know, speaking Spanish, learning to read and write Spanish, let's tell our stories. Let's tell the kind of history of our community. Let's write it together. Those were some of the things that were happening. So again, I think a lot of it was around these themes around defense and expression, and there was a lot around kind of convivencia, or I guess, how would you say convivencia in English? See, translating.
Conviviality?
Conviviality, yeah, it's sort of, so there's different concepts in many of the kind of Latin American concepts, like when we meet like a good life, like who decides what a good life is? And a lot of these communities that, you know, are saying like, they're telling us that a good life is this big capitalist machine, but we see a good life as something quite different, and there's that tension there. But the kind of gathering and coming together and learning from each other, that was something that came out really strongly in those study circles, in those communities, that again, they didn't need a room or a table, although they would fasten things together. They didn't necessarily, sometimes they said the government doesn't bring us the key to our little room, so we just sit outside. So it wasn't kind of the brick and mortar. They just said, this gives us a chance to come together, and sometimes the books get put aside. But we talk about, you know, what, and so in those ways, the study circles operated as something quite differently, quite outside of probably what the government thought or maybe wanted. And I'll just say one more thing that I always thought was really interesting was one facilitator, one community, I remember, they were on kind of a mountain in a specific region in the state of Oaxaca, and they were sort of in the middle of the mountain. And the facilitator was explaining to me that their language designated the region that the government designated the language was Mazateco, which is just a single one according to their kind of count. But she said, but we speak Mazateco middle, in the middle of the mountain. They speak Mazateco alto, in the top, and they speak Mazateco bajo. She's like, and we don't understand each other. But they gave us all the same books. And I said, so what do you do? And she's like, oh, we just changed it. It's like, oh, yeah, they tell me, my learners, they tell me to change it. We write our own thing. We do. And I just thought it was so interesting because it was like this almost casual resistance, but like so powerful as well, where that was what I was really hoping to see or to learn more of, like what happens there, what actually happens. And the thing is, the government probably doesn't know half of what happens either, because they have, you know, all of this decentralized things by states and by regions. And so that was just, it all kind of came together then to me, which was all of this kind of engagement and challenging kind of notions of what reading and writing is and who it's for and how we value it and how we formalize it and what is seen as, again, more valuable types of literacy to get a degree to do these things, or oral history, or how, oral literacy wasn't seen as proper literacy, and it's kind of the social value of that. But to me, it kind of all came back to, I think, so I'm still working on this, which is part of the ongoing process and project of Indigenous self-determination. So how and when these communities continue to organize and find connection and find kind of strength throughout, again, long-standing, ongoing erasure, really.
It fits into my next question because I want to know that through your work with the indigenous communities global south, how has your understanding evolved around the challenges in relationships and outside the universities, researchers, and also indigenous communities, because these are like three different aspects.
I mean, it's changed a lot and it's continuing to change, and I think that's the point, is that I hope it doesn't just stay static, right? Because none of this can. It really, I mean, what's changed, because again, I did this research in it was through a government kind of institution that was the organizing principle behind what I looked at, but then it became so much more outside of that. And then other projects that I've done that have been very kind of university based with a grant, etc. What I think, what has changed for me is thinking of that the interesting kind of findings and conversations and all of these things tend to happen outside of those things, outside of the organizing grant or the organizing agency or whatever. That it was around kind of the dialogue and the kind of sharing of experiences. In one of the projects I worked on for a couple of years, which was based at UCL, we had colleagues in Fiji that, I mean, I never would have gotten a chance to work with colleagues in Fiji before. And it was, again, kind of this reminder, this emphasis of why collaboration, I think, is so important, because we kind of stay in these little silos. And it becomes, again, kind of the reproduction of the global north and these really institutions. We study those places with those problems. We don't have problems. They have them, right? And that sort of hierarchy of how these communities are perceived, it's kind of trying to turn that on its head and say, let's try to actually find out more and build these collaborations. But I think that's really hard in big structures. Sorry, we kind of, what was the, I don't think I answered it.
So I just wanted to build the relationships, because you were talking about how your experiences with the influence.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring it up and the researchers and also universities and
Yeah.
so how, through your experience, these challenges have been evolved. What is essence?
Okay.
Well,
Keep talking about it.
I want to bring back this institution a bit, and because we have been talking about institution, I just want to understand from you that how can indigenous education inform different possibilities for teaching and learning about practices? Because we have been working a lot on practices.
I mean, it's such a good question, and it's such a, you can break it down into little pieces, and that's why I think this becomes something really important to bring in. I'm so glad to hear that you're saying in many courses, in most courses, all courses, there has to be some climate change module. This is not the case everywhere. And then how it's taught, or the purpose, the purported kind of role of that course is very different, right? Is it sort of a checklist of here's this issue, we should all know about it, let's move on? Or is it a type of climate change education that actually, and again, not a lot of, well, I don't know, I haven't done a study of all climate change modules, but this is something that came out in the study when my colleague and I interviewed academics who were all adjacent and designated as experts, climate experts by that institution, is there was very little, in fact, no mention of any of the work around justice. And yet, there are the climate justice collectives and the student groups, and so this kind of tension was very kind of there. It was very conspicuous to us because we were like, okay, and that was one of the things we asked was, around their values as academics in terms of what values do they bring to their work. So maybe this is a qualitative interviewing faux pas where you don't want to have a leading question, but our leading question was, can you tell us what and how you kind of conceptualize climate justice as? And it took a long time, I think, for some of them to get to climate justice. And then they were like, well, of course I support climate justice. And I was like, but how? And that's the thing, okay, is that then what we tend to get are kind of these, and it's understandable, these kind of justice is seen as something like nebulous and oh well, that's for the other people, that's for the lawyers to think about, or that's for these to think about, but actually it's questioning and challenging, okay, how is it throughout everything, throughout every discipline and every course and every module and everything outside of that. And again, I think in teaching and learning, what I would hope to see more of, and again, I don't know, I'm sure this is happening in a lot of places, is this idea is sort of trying to step away a little bit from the idea that climate change education and climate justice is like trying to understand all of the very kind of technocratic issues and solutions, or overly technical. So there are the solar geoengineers who are thinking, oh, if we put something in the sky, we'll dim the sun or whatever. Okay, that's great, but also whose knowledge is there in the solar geoengineering project? Whose communities have you talked to and reached across the table and said, we're going to try this intervention to try to, protect the mangroves, but did they ever actually go into the communities with the mangroves? So I don't really have kind of a solution, more questions, a series of questions that, I think it's important to ask ourselves, which is, in what ways are we trying to think of it in a more kind of systems way of, it's not just the engineers that we need, it's the educators that we need, it's the perspective of the communities, it's all of us, right? And so in climate education and climate justice, I see it just as completely together, right? We can't talk about, how to have rainwater collection without talking about whose knowledge came down to figuring out that system and who and how that benefits or excludes, right? So it can get very, I wish I had a more solid example.
Also actually bringing a different lens to this course, right? So what kinds of lenses are objectively needed when we're talking about climate justice?
So maybe that's sort of part of it that I think is important, are the kind of interdisciplinary lenses. Again, I was saying very kind of crucially, but I think it's worth saying again, which is the students don't have a problem doing this thinking and organizing across disciplines. the university systems themselves and some faculty academics have a harder time, and some funders have a harder time, right? Because they're trying to kind of think of how this is very niche and in this field, but actually, a project that's looking at climate justice, climate change can't not look at the multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral, multi-layered level things. So all of that, I think, is, but I don't know if I would define it as a single lens. I mean, I would say a climate justice lens would then help us do that. But I think it's sort of, and I'm really glad that maybe it was today a change of the regeneration, because I think that's something that has come up also in my work with my colleague, which is around, it's not just responses to climate change, it's not just reactions to climate change, it's not just mitigation, it's not just investment, it's about thinking of what we don't know yet and trying to actually be hopeful and creative about those things and not just give it to, because there's a lot of research on like young people feeling quite like climate doomerism, right? It's like feeling, I feel it too, which is like it's too late, right? But it's not. It's too late maybe for some things, but that's why we have to reimagine other things, right? So that lens, I think, of regeneration, of thinking that the kind of business as usual probably is gonna not work, but okay, there can be, like, we have to rethink business as usual. We have to rethink, status quo and we just, the uncertainty, to be quite anxiety producing, is still, that's the call for us to say, okay, we need to then think of different types of solutions, and we need a lot of different people in the room to come up with these solutions, right? It can't just be the one so-called expert.
Talking about experts, because earlier you mentioned that how universities define climate. Now, what kind of, or what form of knowledge do universities tend to offer you? What about that?
Yeah, it is interesting, and actually, expert, I think, has said it a couple of times here, and so there are two things, like in this very small scale research that we did with academics in this UK university, we were asking them about how they defined expertise and what they thought their expertise was in. And it was interesting because there were a range of things, and they were across disciplines as well. And some were like, well, actually, one of them said, I never took a geography GCSE, like the post-secondary level, and I didn't study geography. I studied something else, and he's like, but I'm a professor in geography, so am I an expert in geography? I don't like it. So I think just kind of problematizing that term itself. There was another professor who said, I mean, my institution designates me as an expert in this, but I don't really feel like I am because I've had to be pulled in so many directions that actually what you're supposed to be an expert in, you're only good at a little bit, and you're good at a lot of other little bits. And he said, and so what they're pushing us to do is become really average on a lot of things. And so, but the expertise kind of angle gets to be sort of the outward facing, this, top institution has all these experts, talk to them about climate change, talk to them about their expertise in their specific siloed fields, right? And I think then, it is kind of questioning what do we mean by who's an expert. I mean, we were talking about, earlier we were having just a conversation about the Brexit stuff in the UK and those debates, including the very famous, infamous quote of, we're sick and tired of the experts, right? But there's something kind of interesting there, which is the government sort of rejecting evidence around how and why to do policy change. But actually, then there's also kind of the disenfranchisement of people whose voices were never there to begin with. And so the elite get to say that they're expert, but they're a self-selecting group. And then the rest of potential experts are very knowledgeable kind of actors and in other places, they're not perceived by, I don't know, social kind of things as being experts, therefore they're not included. So yeah, I think it's something that could be debated a long time. I don't know. Again, if you were to ask me, I would say I'm not an expert in anything, but I'm average in a lot of things.
Yeah, I'm actually about and their paper also warns that the guys being on the science and novel, which can reduce the workings of expertise. Yeah. So my question will be, how can we avoid reproducing the colonial or neocentric frameworks when teaching about climate change and climate justice? Particularly in universities where people in global now,
Yeah.
the UK or in Canada,
Yeah.
I think we are qualified.
So, I mean, there's a lot of work being done. I would say, look to the collectives and the movements and the decolonial scholars who have long called for this and who have had many, forms of sharing and disseminating. I mean, I was looking at Decolonial Futures Collective in the UK. I was reading something off theirs the other day, and I mean there are these organizing kind of, and it's usually very much self-organizing things that happen within universities, for example. I mean, there are those campaigns, World Must Fall, and all of those things that gain the attention, for better or for worse. They say, bad press is still press, good press, right? But like those things can really spark the conversation. But what tends to happen then when demands and kind of these ideas get pushed towards and trying to hold kind of institutions more accountable, we all know also it can turn into kind of a very greenwashy thing, right? Where it's like, okay, well, yes, now this is so and so carbon neutral or whatever. Or our curriculum now has, 50% female and people of color authors. Okay, that's a start, right? Like, first of all, you're recognizing by default that it hasn't included that in the first place. But I think that we kind of run the risk of that kind of the token person of color or the token paper by an indigenous scholar just to try to, and I'm not saying anyone here would do that, but like it can happen. So beyond that, how would we, I mean, and this is just completely my ideas, which is like, I've seen an effort, for example, where my good friend, my colleague works at the University of Leeds. They have a sustainability research institute where they purposefully bring people from different disciplines to work in that institute, and their focus is on participatory and action-oriented research. Not research for the glory of a few, but participatory action-based research as the organizing principle of that research institute. So no form of research that doesn't kind of have at its core and has an ethos of like co-production of knowledge and collaboration, and then I'm with a project with them at the moment where we had sort of a workshop with undergraduate students, and it was very participatory. And everyone who was in that room is a co-author of what's going to come out, because we all contributed to the thinking and what was happening there. So, I mean, again, it's so much easier said than done, though, right? Because we can talk about participatory action, oriented research, we can try to drive that, we can do this, but systems kind of don't always facilitate that very well.
I'm also curious to know about the classrooms, how the teaching is happening within the classroom. So your paper already raises questions about response comes.
Yeah.
You also been talking about response weirdness.
Yeah.
Then how do you bring those discussions within the classroom and how can the classrooms make that space for the local self perspectives within the education itself?
I mean, that's a really good question because I know the remit of my role in working at the university and I teach in a classroom. But I think sometimes it has to go beyond that, and we have to always think of how it goes beyond that. Because if we were to take away all of this, would we still be here talking about this? And could we? And if we could, what would happen? If we, I'm sort of kind of, I try to think in terms of like pedagogical terms and critical pedagogy, and I bring in all these things, and at the end of the day, I'm still like, completely constrained by a timetable and by the assignment, and let's look at, the online thing, and all of a sudden, these opportunities become much, much more restricted. But I also know and have seen how it can work. For example, at my university, there's a outdoor environmental Master of Science program, and they have a lot of sort of, it's outdoor education, but they teach outdoors. They go out, they do field trips, they do residentials together, they make fire, and then our campus police comes and tries to put out the fire. They have a module called climate catastrophe. In actually the context of my institution, it's quite a fringe, more radical little program. But I think again, we need to reimagine what we mean by, is that really radical to actually take the students outside, to take them to the communities, to talk to them, to think of projects that aren't just an exam or an assessment that's not just an exam or this or that, but actually they do reflective journals, they like autoethnography of like how they come into this whole thing, their position and their research. Those are the ways I think you can sort of little by little in your little corner try to think about how to bring it into the classroom. But again, I would almost encourage, and I tell myself, like, I have such limited time in the classroom, and I'm always thinking about what goes on inside of it. And I try to make that time count to then.
Also, you mentioned, I know, in one of your papers that you were talking about the dangers of separating the expertise from the experiences, and you're looking at the new goal to the communities.
Yeah.
And the students can learn.
Yeah.
And they can actually have the experience. But you also think, what about other kind of specific behaviors, for example? Can they do the same? Can they bring that kind of, do they have those facilities or privilege?
Right. No, I think that's exactly it. It's like to be able to even develop a program like that is to benefit from a lot of work that's come before to make sure that that can happen, and that you can actually safely challenge somewhat the status quo of business as usual. That you can, in your validation of a new program, put in climate catastrophe and it doesn't get squashed down. Like that it absolutely is a privilege that then you can't just as easily say, well, all institutions should have this, and all is because you don't know the political context they're operating in, the resource constraints, all of that kind of absolutely plays into it. So I mean, I think if we talk about climate educators as a group, everyone is a climate educator, like everyone could be. And all of those organizing spaces would still become a space for climate education. Again, would it be able to be as maybe organized and sophisticated as in some places? No. But I think again, there's lots to learn from just being in your community, in your little corner, and seeing what can happen. No, thanks.
I was wondering of time, so this will be a fun question.
Okay.
So I'll open the floor to everyone. I'd like to end our conversation about helpful knowledge as far as partner justice is concerned. Because the partner data doesn't give us a role, but from your experience, from your position, what advice do you offer to future partner scholars?
What advice I offer? I mean, I think at the core, it really is kind of, and it might sound sort of trite because we probably do this a lot in education, but it's about reflexivity. As climate scholars, educators, and particularly, there's a scholar at the University of Liverpool, Leon Musavi, talks about decolonial reflexivity, where it's maybe, rather than always thinking that all of this work and around climate and climate justice has to be solution oriented, sometimes it's also about reframing our questions. What are we asking the right questions? Are we okay sometimes being wrong? Right? So a little bit of kind of epistemic humility sometimes, right? Of saying like, we might be so-called experts, but we don't have the answers, and that's why we need to reach across. If we're at the table, then what are we going to bring to it, and how can we, again, in kind of very dialogic ways, try to frame ideas together. So, I mean, really, I think it's still quite abstract, right? So those actions would look really different in different institutions and for different people. And so, for example, I think of even today talking about all of this, and I'm all energized. Back in my, institution, I have an email that's pinned that says, "Lorena, let's talk about the Decolonial Collective," and it's like 3 weeks old, and I haven't had a chance to look at it, right? So it looks so different for all of us. But I think the point is, and we mentioned kind of this hopeful ending, but I think that's it. It's like there has to be, even if our institutions don't always overtly support it or say like that's important, like it is the driving force of all of our work. We have hope. We have to have it, otherwise we wouldn't do this. We wouldn't be here. And sometimes when we don't feel it, we feel it from our students. And sometimes when the students don't feel it, they feel it from us. And so it's this reciprocal kind of regenerative relationship, kind of relational element that I think we just need to, again, reflect on and remember that it's not the whatever paper that got published that's, I mean, yes, that's an output and that can mean something in different terms, but actually when it comes to it, we're trying again to think of things together. And that is hopeful. I mean, it is. We can talk about it again, and it looks really different in different ways. And I always say again, I am not going to change or solve all of this. But in my little corner, what can I do, right?
So much, Jenny. Yeah.
Oh,
So audience, yeah, just jump in. All your Yes.
You talked about, taking students outdoors as being radical education.
In
And
the,
I was thinking, if that's radical, man, we're in trouble.
in the UK it is, yeah.
I can take it
So-
off because I think if we
So I can, I guess that raised the question in my mind, what is radical education? And the other question is, what's wrong with radical education?
Yeah. Such a good question. And again, this is something that I'm sure each of us would have a different reflection on. I can, like, just a sort of an idea that really popped in. I was reading about it earlier just to remind myself. It was 2019 with a colleague that I met during my master's. We were single-mindedly obsessed with intercultural universities in Latin America. If any of you heard of them or studied them or researched them, we were like, and so our paper is literally called "We Have to Talk About Intercultural Universities," because there's something really interesting with those types. I think those would be considered so-called radical, more on the radical side. Why? So there's a lot of things, particularly in Latin America, about universities being autonomous. So like my university I went to is this Autónoma de Barranquilla, so the autonomous university. Why is that? It's in response to no government and political interference, because this has happened and it continues to happen, even in these so-called autonomous. So intercultural universities kind of emerged in all of this discussion, kind of post NAFTA and the Zapatista uprising and all of this stuff that was sort of saying like that those systems don't respond to us, so we're going to make our own. And they look really different across Latin America. Some are very kind of more university-like, and some of them are very kind of grassroots. We don't have degrees in this way, or sort of organizing just on different ways. But then again, I think your question is like, why is that? Again, it's about the legitimacy then that's conferred or not, right, to these kind of organizations and community and grassroots organizations that can come up and say, I mean, there's the Universidad de la Tierra, there's a University of the Earth in Mexico that historically, and still I believe to this day, they do not let any researcher go to research, because research in that context is a violent, colonial, extractive process. So I'd be fascinated to visit, but I wouldn't be welcome. And maybe that's a good thing.
So I work with NGOs and community-based programs, and we have to deal with shifting government priorities and policies. And I was especially intrigued when you were talking about the sort of tension that exists between the priorities of your learners and that from like government's policies. And I was really eager to hear more about like how you navigate that tension. How do you let your learners lead the way? And
Yeah. I mean, so this was again in the context of the adult literacy program and the research that I did. I again, constraints of all sorts, I wouldn't have a way to sort of capture on a more longitudinal sense what that may have looked like. So this research, for example, was in 2018. A lot has happened and a lot has changed. But I would say, again, what the little that I was able to kind of find there was that this is not happening, like these sort of challenges to what the government says we should do and what we're doing on a relatively small scale. It was happening, it has happened, it was happening, and it will continue to happen. And maybe we don't know in terms of like measurable, quantifiable ways that can happen, but it's happening. The dialogue is there, the kind of building is there. And I guess in our roles, and maybe in your role, is in terms of kind of working across different organizations and trying to figure out maybe it is kind of a matter of, are we pausing a bit to reflect again on what the different responses are, what the students maybe are saying or challenging. So that facilitator who had no problem whatsoever with metaphorically throwing the book out the window, right? And saying like, I do what they tell me to do. Because in the end, I mean, if you talk about incentives, you know, the government didn't give them any financial incentives, so why shouldn't they challenge everything, right? And I don't know, I guess it's like the type of accountability, like what are they gonna do? Tell them that they have to use the books? No, like that, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your.
Yeah, no, it helps.
Okay.
I wanted to pick up on that because I talked to a planner from the University of Hawaii. He was a South Asian researcher working in Hawaii on indigenous brand.
Mm.
And he said to me, he said, the world is now a place where the great ideas are coming from the South. He said the problem with the North is that we think that the solutions are formal ones. He said many of the solutions that come from the South have a layer of informality
Yes.
that you have to accept when you accept the entire idea. Now what's happening is they're ripping ideas off, they're not working, and we're shrugging their shoulders, blaming the South for bad ideas. So I wonder if the informal piece is what you just described, and it's built in, government agencies know it, communities know it, they live with it. Whereas if you try that same thing here in the North, we go bananas.
Because we can't measure it in the same way. Because again, the way that things have been constructed, I remember kind of one of the conclusions of one of the papers that was shared was like, we can talk about the benefits of this type of program. We can talk about, because I'm not gonna bash it entirely, right? It's not about that. But we can't look at its success solely by these measures that someone else has decided are measures of success. Measures of success, well, first of all, let's throw out the word measures, and we say, throw out the word success. I have no idea what the term is, but we can look at things also from the perspective of, you know, the community building and bringing people together. That should be, you ask me, a measure of its success. But it's not seen as that because it's not formalized in that, because that's not how the government blah blah blah, right? And it could go on and on. But I think you're right, like the danger then is trying to sort of like the wrong type of policy ordering, right? When we just say, oh, this worked in Germany, let's pop it over here in Fiji. No, it doesn't work like that. And then, blame game doesn't work either, right? But maybe again, it's trying to kind of get people who are very used to thinking and operating in a certain way, doing things differently, and that's uncomfortable. And it can reveal a lot of things that can make people uncomfortable, a lot of their own biases, things like that.
I wrote this line down that you said, certainty is the call for making solutions. I thought that was a good line. I sort of own that now. Keep it brown.
Yeah.
Yeah, just make sure.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a somewhat contextual question in relation to the Mexican context. I think it's a context that applies in other ones as well, but I'm very familiar with it. I don't know if it's might be interesting. So I find it like super interesting that both the like post-independence discourse and like others, post-revolutionary discourse, others, post-neoliberal discourse, others, and again, I don't want to show you cards, but like but some might say sort of like the kind of emergence of the kind of new left of critical discourse, critical of all of those layers. Whenever you read them more or less independently, we can even go back to Aquinas, we could go into even other sources, but even if we just work kind of like from the sort of the end of I know Mexico went back for help from France and stuff, but the kind of the big end, well, the big
Yes.
independence, right?
Yeah.
History's not.
History is
And
very,
when you speak to someone you don't know, you don't want them to think that you don't know the history. So, you know, like.
thank you, I was gonna say, well, what about France?
I know. The point I'm making though is that at every stage along that storyline, to the contemporary one, every single actor who was not an agent of the king and queen spoke of their project in broadly, if not within the last century, explicitly decolonial terms, post-colonial, anti-colonial, obviously. And so for me, one of the interesting tensions, and sometimes you can probably tell, somewhat point of irritation, is the sense that sort of like my decoloniality context, whatever, is the right one. And you know, I've sat at tables with priestas saying, "No, you don't understand. We are actually the decolonial part of Mexico," and it's like of course, right? You know, you want to just laugh out loud in their face. But those tables happen, and I'm interested about kind of how to sit at a table where you have that kind of like Spider-Man meme, where everyone thinks they're the real decolonial actor, and it's hard, I think, to throw out even some of the most famously bad actors, especially in the Mexican context, because the whole like, you know, we're not perfect, but we know how to govern radio commercials, you know. It's kind of true, right? I mean, in terms of just base experience.
Yeah.
So I wonder how you navigate that, especially within a Mexican context where there's actually a lot of credibility. I think that I don't know as well the Canadian context as I probably should. I know in the American context, you can kind of just call out bad faith in a lot of directions and kind of eliminate certain bad actors. In the Mexican context, I find that there's some real legitimacy to people's decolonial credentials at the table, as much as you want to maybe get rid of some people
Yeah.
because of this moral and political atrocities and things like that. So I wonder, how do you navigate this kind of like Spider-Man meme of everyone's kind of decolonial?
Such a good question. I have no idea how I navigate day to day, hour by hour. I think, you know, you're faced with it and confronted with it in different ways. In the kind of very patronizing, no, you don't know what you're talking about ways, and in the I want to learn from you ways. Like it's all over the place. I mean, not to give away my cards, but I find it. I'm extremely skeptical of anyone who says that they're the top whatever, or that I'm all for the poor. You know what I mean? When their actions don't always necessarily show it, or that this is the you know, we're anti, you know, neoliberal when your policies don't really. So anyway, again, it's like trying to see through a lot of the discourse and try to actually see what's happening. So I mean, navigating it, I mean, very again close to my research. I told you my fieldwork was in 2018, and I was supposed to have another like 6 months or something to plan my fieldwork, but the elections were that year. Was it that summer? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It was summer 2018 when the One Enough Party came into power, or was elected, and they were going to come into power in January. And my contact, the former person who had started this program, who didn't work for the government anymore, they basically said, "You need to go now, because I have contacts who I can put you in touch with, and you can see about which states you can go to. And I have no guarantee. I have no idea. There's no guarantee that they would let you in after this new I said regime. Comes in. Sorry, slip of tongue. So I moved everything forward, and even then there was one state where I had to still like speak to the municipal leader, and they basically grilled me like, what are you gonna ask? and there were blockades in Oaxaca that, you know, like all of these things happened. And again, you're sort of when the political power is so concentrated in the kind of urban everything and the reality of a country is so concentrated in basically a make-believe world. You don't know the rest of the country. And I would place myself there. I'm from a, you know, urban, not one of the biggest cities, but we're very disconnected from the realities and the huge, like, different needs and just ways of living and understanding the world in the same country, in the same states.
Right.
And I think it's that. It's sort of, I think again, you laid it out pretty well in saying, like, what we do have to do is recognize this very colorful history. And
I was gonna say, even the carteles now are
yes,
using colonial kind of language,
yes,
anti-elitist language.
yeah, I mean, well, the autonomous zones and the Zapatistas that, you know, they were like, well, we're gonna arm ourselves, and Marcos and all these people, they were like, you know, we have to defend this, and then there were people, yeah, there's always gonna be, but I don't know, that's where I worry, I think that also these buzzwordy kind of things, or these tokenistic things get kind of co-opted, and then they get to tick the box and say, us, the narco groups, or colonial, I mean, like, I don't know, for 40 people, I don't know, it's complicated,
Yeah.
to say the least.
That's nice.
Maybe we can talk about it more.
I appreciated your encouragement to be hopeful and creative. I believe those were the words you used in our approaches to climate justice education. I'm wondering if you could share an example that you feel has been successful in nurturing those two values, hope and creativity.
Oh, I mean, so I would say again that I'm close to, but I don't teach on that MSc program in outdoor environmental education at my institution. And again, to give you a little bit of context, like many higher education institutions, like most in the UK, it's the postgraduate level especially is like 90% international students. And there's, you know, lots of things behind that, which I won't necessarily get into because you were asking about hope, and it's not a very nice kind of talking about marketization. But, and again, I haven't myself been on, but I talk to my colleagues a lot, and there's a story that Sarah, my colleague, tells. She's the program leader, and she said, you know, it's really interesting doing a canoeing activity while talking to each other, while seeing people from different countries tell each other what the best way is to row and how to navigate that, because, where I'm from, and all of a sudden you have like this flash of all of these things happening at the same time. And then, you know, in the formalized sense, there's a reflection on what they did in the module and how they communicated and all these things. But I would say, even if that activity or an activity like that produces maybe some clash, right? Like, no, that's not the right way to do it. I think again, we have to learn how to disagree in a more productive way. And I think that could be quite hopeful, that we can put ourselves in uncomfortable situations. Maybe someone doesn't know how to swim. I think I remember part of the story being like, I'm not getting in that boat, right? And then they do because it's part of it. So like trying to kind of overcome those things, show support, solidarity. I mean, it can be uncomfortable. I think that's it. And it's actually being okay with that and saying like, it's okay if you're uncomfortable, let's talk about it. Instead of just saying, no, just do it. And I think that would, I don't know, again, does every place have the resources to go to get canoes into the lake? No. So I would say then maybe we just need to think about how we could bring in types of activities that aren't necessarily as high stakes, and that we can kind of have that, I guess, sort of agreement of safe spaces to be able to disagree and then learn and unlearn and learn again.
Thinking
Thank you so much. I can see we're almost at the end of that talk. Thank you again. I'm sure the conversation will go on, but many of might have to leave. So we'll wrap it up here and thank you.
Thank you so much.